Hello, dear listeners. On today's episode, we'll be talking Herman Melville's experimental, borderline postmodern novel from 1857 entitled The Confidence Man, His Masquerade. A novel in which there is no discernible main character and no real plot to speak of. Instead, the reader is presented with a series of shifting vignettes featuring a series of con artists aboard a riverboat from St. Louis to New Orleans. These con artists pretend to be Freemasons, sell faulty stocks and herbal cures, and collect donations for the dubious Seminole Widows and Orphans Fund. Along the way, we are treated to Melville's expert rendering of dialogue and ideas on the nature of trust, the importance of money, and the impossibility of certain belief. Are these all different con artists, or all these manifestations of the same man? Do these con artists know each other, or are they strangers? The book is never completely clear, and just when we're certain we may have figured out the truth, Melville provides just the right detail to make us question. The second half of the book exchanges these changing personages for the stable figure of the cosmopolitan, who seeks to question the people he meets on their beliefs. This book, as you can probably guess, was not well received in America upon its release, but was eventually critically discovered over time. Herschel Parker, writing for the Norton Critical Edition of the book, expressed that The Confidence Man is one for the true Herman Melville heads, and noted in a description that I hope applies to the listeners of the Infinite Library podcast that the true Melvillian loves metaphysical mulligatawny. He or she likes satirical curry hot in the mouth, savors the ginger of blasphemy in diabolical ragouts, relishes punning with ideas perhaps more than punning with words. In unepic moods, the Melvillian likes the Confidence Man almost as much as Moby Dick. We are joined by a friend of the pod and major Melville enthusiast, Chris Thomas, who provided some much-needed expertise to the proceedings. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
Welcome back, ladies and germs, to the Infinite Library special, not quite April Fool's Day edition. Ben, insert some like silly horns and what are the things you do at parties where you blow in them and go?
Oh yeah, like with streamers or whatever. Yeah, I don't remember the name of those. But
I don't know what those are called, but I love them. Put some of those in there because we're talking about a silly book today, or perhaps a not so silly book. Ben and I are here with a special guest to talk about a lesser read book by one of America's greatest novelists. That would be The Confidence Man, His Masquerade by Mr. Herman Melville.
Yeah, John. So I picked this book because you were saying we got to talk Herman Melville. And since, as John's sort of been alluding to, it's definitely like con artist season in America. And I felt like it might be particularly useful to read one of Herman Melville's books that is directly about basically confidence men and the act of putting confidence in somebody else or receiving it from someone. And I decided to ask my friend, Chris Thomas, a man I have complete confidence in, to help assist us in this construction of this book. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ben and John. I appreciate you guys putting your trust in me today to read. We all call Herman Melville one of the great novelists, and then we don't read any of his books besides Moby Dick. So I'm always excited for the opportunity to talk about other Herman Melville books.
And that was like another reason I wanted to talk about this book, because Herman Melville has quite an interesting career, of which I'm glad Chris is here to assist me on, because I only have the broad strokes of it. But the general idea is, we all hear about Moby Dick, so maybe we read it, a great American novel, and we don't quite know that Herman Melville's career had sort of an interesting arc to it, where he got famous for these sea voyaging novels that he wrote before Moby Dick. Then when he wrote Moby Dick, it was very poorly received, and his career sort of had like a bit of a nosedive. It gets into more of the complicated and experimental stuff. And then that stuff isn't really reclaimed until much later. And so it's useful to kind of look at his lesser known stuff and be like, why is he one of the greatest American novelists? What does he look like when he's feeling his oats, so to speak? And what can we learn about conning and sort of America circa, I guess it was like 1850. I think I've got the date wrong. But are there any similarities between then and now?
Yeah, those are the broad strokes. And I think the main thing is that most people don't know what you said there at the outset, Ben, that despite how popular Moby Dick is now, it was not well received in its time at all. And it took a long time for scholars to kind of find out about Melville and frame him as this great author. But the short version is Melville actually did travel at sea. He jumped ship at some point while he was at sea, and he landed in the Marquesas Isles in this small island of Nuka Hiva, and he wrote the novel Typee that was about this experience. And that made him famous as a very young author. And as Melville got older, he grew resentful of being famous in this way. He hated being called the man who lived among the cannibals, and he wished that people liked his other works, and they did not. And so Melville's career was a series of him becoming more and more sad that people did not like his work. So he never really got to experience what we would know now as people thinking of him as this great author.
Yeah, and specifically with Confidence Man, I believe he told Nathaniel Hawthorne, one of his friends, that this book was his farewell to prose, because he had written one book between Moby Dick and this, which was Pierre, the Ambiguities, and then he wrote Confidence Man, and then his last book was Clarel, which was an extremely long poem about his experience traveling to Jerusalem, I believe. And so this is his last like prose work. And I think as we get into it, we're going to find out that like, I think there's a lot of features of this that resemble poetry, and that there's a lot of emphasis placed on certain words. There's a lot of poetic ambiguity. It's sort of hard to tell who's who at certain times. And I would say the meaning of the work tends to shift, which can make the experience reading it somewhat mind-boggling at times. Although, you know, if you've read it a couple times, if you've read it before, like sometimes it's familiar. But I was telling John and Chris pre-recording that like there's an entry period to this book where I feel lost, and then at some point I start figuring out what's going on. But I think you're deliberately supposed to be a little like confused at times.
It has its own language.
Yeah. As someone who I'll cop to being a bit of a Melville novice, I'm guessing compared to both of you. I've read Moby Dick, but this is only my second experience with Melville. I was struck by just the absolutely bizarre construction of this book. The fact that, I mean, we can talk about maybe if this is even an interesting question to ask, but like, is this even a novel, or is it something else entirely? Because it doesn't have much of a plot. It really almost barely has characters in a way. It's almost more allegorical in a sense in the way it's employing characters a lot of times. It has a lot of kind of digressions into like essay or short story that reminded me a lot of Don Quixote.
Oh, yeah.
Not sure if there was any like deliberate attempts to do something similar there, but this feels like a book that I would expect to read from an earlier era in like the history of the novel.
Yeah,
like
definitely.
This feels like a book that is not familiar with the conventions of like novelistic fiction, or is actively rejecting them. And maybe, like you said, Ben, this being his quote unquote farewell to prose, it's also a farewell to conventional like plot structure and kind of the mores of the literature of the day. Moby Dick is obviously not a conventionally like plotted novel, but there is like a narrative, point A to point B that you go to. And this kind of doesn't have that. We start in kind of not in media res. We start with a pretty actually kind of standard opening of a man gets on a boat. But after that, we end like kind of just in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, it's like night falls on the boat. There's characters that we didn't start with talking to each other, and then somebody says, "What is it? Like more may happen," something like that. Like something further may follow from this masquerade. So, and that's pretty much it. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think Melville was good at writing novels, despite the fact that we think of him that way. He was never good at it. That's why most of the time, you'll notice even in Moby Dick, he's taking stories from other people, as often as we'll talk about in Confidence Man. A lot of the stuff he takes is not original. He's kind of taking different things, putting it into this book. And Melville is an ideas person, and he would try to kind of fit things into novels. And I think that's why, this book comes across so strangely. He was more interested in kind of philosophy and making these arguments. And so it makes sense that the Confidence Man doesn't really have much of a kind of narrative, because, as we might talk a little bit about later, the last time he tried to write a novel in Pierre, he was pretty much humiliated by the reviews that he got back from that.
It's interesting. I went back and looked at what my main man Harold Bloom had to say about this one, and he called this book unreadable, which I think in his case was maybe not a compliment, but not. It wasn't like a necessarily a statement on the quality of the book so much as it is a statement on just like the experience of reading the book.
Yeah, there's some good contemporary review lines that might be worth bringing up. The one I like the best is, "A novel it is not, unless a novel means 45 conversations held on board a steamer, conducted by personages who might pass for the errata of creation, and so far resembling the dialogues of Plato as to be an undoubted Greek to ordinary men."
See, at least that's like, okay, it's people talking, but Bloom's just like frowning and like, this is unreadable. Like, that's how.
But did you guys find it hard to read?
So let me put it this way. I between my experiences last weekend and then the fact that I'm going into the busy season of my work, I read this with a lot of constraints on me.
Yeah.
And I got through it.
Yeah.
And I was telling Chris, because I've read this before, there's always a point where I'm just like, I don't know what's going on. Like, I don't know if I'm being conned or not. Like, I'm like, they're saying words and I'm scrutinizing specific word choices. And like, I usually figure it out, but that like initial onboarding period is like overwhelming at some points. So,
yeah.
I mean, it's a book that there's no plot. You don't need to worry about that.
Yeah.
No, there is never any concern. Like once you figure it out, like, I guess there is like some threads that you do need to pick up on, but there's no plot, especially once the Cosmopolitan comes in. It's kind of like, all right, I'm done with the con stuff. Let's just go straight with Cosmopolitan now.
Yeah, I guess the closest thing to a plot there is just keeping track of like, okay, which character is the Confidence Man right now?
Right.
It's usually fairly obvious,
right?
But sometimes it isn't.
Yeah. No, I think when I first read it, it's like there is some confusion about like who Charlie Noble is supposed to be, and like, is he a Confidence Man? Is he the same Confidence Man? Are they all the same Confidence Man?
Is everyone the Confidence
Man?
It's funny to read this in the background of like the stock market crashing, and like we were pretty close to April Fool's Day, which is when the book came out. So, like,
and when the book takes place,
yeah.
Which was very intentional, by the way. I'm just gonna guess that he had that in mind. But yeah, it does feel like really good timing to talk about Confidence Men right now.
Yeah, I mean, America has always been the scam society, but perhaps no more than now.
Right? Yeah.
That's what I was saying to Ben, that makes sense that Melville predicted like the end times would be heralded by a confidence man. That's the book of Revelation for Melville's ending, is like just this con man at the end, just swindling a poor old man who doesn't know any better, who thinks this person really wants to help him. And he's like different than all the other, con men, the real con men.
So in some ways this is sort of like a deliberate rejection, like John was saying, of convention in terms of like, whatever the literary realism of the time was. I also think, John, bringing up Don Quixote is great because I think the narrator does bring up Don Quixote at times during the parts where suddenly the text becomes like an essay about what is good character in fiction. And then also I think he was reading Don Quixote based on one of the footnotes.
I was going to ask you something about that, though, Ben, since you're a Don Quixote person. Isn't the barber a kind of Don Quixote trope?
The idea of the barber being somebody who's like encountering that one character, or I mean, there is like they do try to get like the barber's wash basin because Don Quixote thinks it's like a magical crown, and they end up like getting in a fight with a barber. And I think one of the characters who is like taking care of Don Quixote is a barber. Because him and somebody else are the guys who are like, Don Quixote's reading too much chivalric fiction. We need to lock his library away from him so that he stops reading it. And so then they like throw out all the books that are like corrupting him. So I think the barber is like a truth teller is also in there. And also I think like Melville in those essays where he's talking about character that are interspersed throughout Confidence Man is like, many people think like Don Quixote is like an original character, but actually like it's because of the standards that they have on characters that they think this. And he's like using that as a way to like justify why characters behave the way that they do in Confidence Man. So like you were saying, Chris, there's like ideas about character running through this more so than like what we might come to expect, for character or for like, 19th century stuff. But I did want to ask, John, did your copy have footnotes? Because before we start, I wanted to ask if everybody's copy had footnotes, because I have a Dalkey archive edition of this and it's like loaded with footnotes. And because Confidence Man is all about like questioning the veracity of who's speaking, I began to like wonder, like, is this footnote guy putting a con on me? Like, what's going on here? And I was curious to see what your experience of like if you had footnotes in your copy, John, before we like get into plot stuff.
Yeah, no, and I kind of wish I found myself wishing at several points that it had. I got this book from the library, and it is the blurriness on the Zoom is making it hard to see. But this is like a ancient like copy that was printed in like 1961.
Oh
and
wow!
is
okay,
still in like pretty good shape actually, which probably speaks to how many people have checked it out over the intervening decades. But yeah, I definitely kind of found myself wishing that I had like an annotated edition or something, because I felt like there was almost certainly like cultural references that were just kind of going over my head. Yeah, so I did not have footnotes, but I don't think that not having footnotes kept me from enjoying it, but I definitely think that maybe they would have made my appreciation greater for it. It's interesting. This book is probably just old enough where it's kind of entered like it's not historical fiction, but it is far enough in the past that a modern reader is not going to recognize some of the things they're talking about.
Yeah.
I feel safe saying.
Well, and I think, Chris, you had the Norton Critical Edition, right? Because you were telling me that the guy who put that together was pushing a specific reading at times in the footnotes, I think, unless he was being more even-handed about it.
This is from Herschel Parker, who's a big Melville scholar. But yes, many of his footnotes will categorically make statements about the Confidence Man literally being the devil. And so it doesn't give you much space to say, is that true? Is it not true? It's like he already decided it for us. He is the devil.
Yeah, and it's like in mine, he was like, one might read this as the devil, like the guy that put together these. So it's like, I like that, like that sort of suspicion of authenticity or like truth telling is kind of in the footnotes as well at times. Yeah. And maybe Parker's trying to dispel that, being he's like the one in charge or something, but like this is his interpretation. But I don't know, something interesting that I just wanted to mention because I feel like it kind of affects the reading of the book because it is hard to pin down. So I think unless we have something we want to bring up for background, I think we can zoom into talking about the book, unless anyone wanted to bring anything else up.
Yeah, the only thing I thought of as we were talking, and I apologize, this kind of circling us back just a smidge, the barber. So I think that what's there, I don't know if that's a direct reference to Don Quixote, but I know that there is a trope of like barbers. Not so much that barbers are trustworthy, but that a good barber is trustworthy because barbers are. I remember this like goes back even to like Roman writing where you wanted your most trusted slave to be your barber because they were the ones who were literally holding sharp knives and razors by your jugular vein regularly.
Which also comes up in another Melville novel.
Oh, really?
Yes. Nito Serino, that exact scenario does occur.
Yeah. So I think pitting a barber who, if he's good at his job, should be trustworthy against a confidence man. I'm guessing, given Melville's clear, like classical leanings, I think that is certainly that's like a knowing thing he's doing there. I think that also with Don Quixote, that's probably why the barber is like there, being like, oh, we need to help this man because he's a trustworthy fellow.
Yeah, our footnote in this one talks about barbers being a staple in literature, as in Don Quixote and the Arabian Nights. But Melville may have had in mind a story in P.T. Barnum's The Life of P.T. Barnum. Melville himself contributed a racy anecdote to the genre, according to an alert who grew to become a famous editor.
Interesting.
Yeah, P.T. Barnum, also a con man, and... And like I like the idea too, because I feel like at some point barbers were also like doctors because they handled all the knives, so they would do like bloodletting. But I don't know what the specific time period for that.
I think that was previous to this point in time.
Yeah.
And maybe they were still doing like tooth pullings or something like in kind of these more frontiersy areas. But I don't think they were like barber surgeons at this point.
Yeah. Well, good to know that he was thinking of both Don Quixote and con artists, which feel like on brand. So I think we could probably jump into the first. So I would say the first part of the book takes place on April Fool's Day, which was also coincidentally when the book came out. And it's on a riverboat that is, I can't remember. I think St. Louis. I think it's leaving St. Louis.
Ben, how could you?
Yeah, right.
How could you forget? I was about to say this is the first play the air horns because St. Louis mentions. Yeah, we start in St. Louis with the boarding of a riverboat, kind of a cosmopolitan crew of people from all over America and the world boarding this riverboat. I think Melville is very deliberately kind of making this into, this riverboat is supposed to be a microcosm for the world. So we have all these different kinds of people boarding it on business. They're headed south, presumably to New Orleans along the mighty Mississippi. We kind of start by creating this microcosm of a world where all these people are going to encounter this figure. We also start with a particular figure, this mute in a cream-colored suit, who kind of, I feel like, is set up in this chapter. In a more traditional book, this would be the main character.
Yeah.
And in some ways, he might be. But it's a little hard to say.
Yeah, because he shows up. He's also, I believe, deaf too, right? I think. He's got like a chalkboard and he's writing Bible verses on it. The Bible verses are basically all about like trusting man.
Charity thinketh no evil. Charity suffereth long and is kind. Charity endureth all things. Charity believeth all things. Charity never faileth.
And so, like, immediately there's this juxtaposition between him asserting this, him being unable to properly communicate with the people on board, as well as everybody thinking that he might not be who he says he is. And there's this sort of like atmosphere of skepticism and uncertainty that starts basically almost from the first chapter. But as you're saying, John, like in maybe a more traditional one, he would encounter various people, but he is sort of like immediately exchanged for this other character, Black Guinea, who is basically like having his veracity called upon by the crowd. Black Guinea is again purported to not be who he says he is, and he goes, please find these other people that will vouch for my authenticity, and he names all of these subsequent characters. They're described by their appearances, and he goes, talk to these people and you'll find out if I am trustworthy or not. And then the rest of the chapters in the first half are each chapter takes place with one person who might be in that list of people, and we don't really return to the deaf mute character, and it's just a series of conversations more or less about these people who might speak for Black Guinea's trustworthiness.
Yeah, and we don't know if the deaf mute is also part of this confidence man, if he is the setup to it, right? If it's necessary before these cons happen to see this character who is putting up these literal chalkboard signs about charity, and getting that in people's minds already, right? So people are sort of primed for the confidence man. We don't know if this person is really angelic, because he's described as kind of angelic with the cream colors and the soft way that he falls asleep, and then he just kind of disappears, right? As you said, Ben, and we have this character of Black Guinea, who is seeking to get money from people through a performance, right? This super exaggerated performance that ultimately leads to people literally throwing coins into his mouth, and so. Yeah. It quickly turns into a spectacle, right? It starts as almost this scene that's pitiful, and then it turns into this kind of really dark spectacle.
Well, and it's interesting too, because he's not performing in a traditional sense. Like he's not like playing music necessarily. I mean, he has a tambourine, but it's not like, oh, he's really jamming out. He's not like a street performer. He is an old Black crippled man. And he's, basically trying to talk people into giving him, money out of the goodness of their hearts. And it's really interesting. And I think speaks to kind of the politics of the time, that what happens is a white cripple shows up and is like, he's faking. He's not a real cripple.
Yeah.
Because he's threatened by this man who has this extra quality that makes him more pitiful than the white cripple. And so he's getting all the attention.
And then the money too. Yeah, as a result of that. Yeah.
And he brings up the possibility that this person is actually dressed in blackface, right? That is, a literal imposter.
And I think like the Black Guinea and the character who gets on the boat are like all like, because the first character is also handicapped, but Black Guinea is getting money as a result of this, and the first character is not. So there's like this twinning of those two. And as you were saying, John, this sort of like accusation of inauthenticity.
Yeah. I found this section to be a little bit, I mean, it's definitely uncomfortable just from the standpoint that we don't maybe this was progressive for its day, but I almost like the vernacular dialect that Melville puts Guinea's voice in. It was almost impossible for me to make out at points in terms of what he was saying. Like, it took me forever to figure out that a yarb doctor was an herb doctor.
Yeah, and he's also like picking words that are puns as well in that rendering, John. So there's like a kind of like artificialness to all of it, but.
Yeah, which again, I think is deliberate. I think that something that I think is admirable about this book is that it really commits from the jump to this ambiguity. Like Black Guinea could be fake. The white cripple could be right. This could be it could be the confidence man. It could be I don't know how if the deaf mute is the confidence man. I don't know how we could have done a quick change that fast, but it's possible. Or, Black Guinea could be the confidence man, and he is just giving a list of his alternative identities so that he's creating this like feedback loop of trust in these people.
Yeah.
And yeah, I feel like when I think about like the things that make this book kind of its maybe not of its time, but kind of singular, it is that commitment to ambiguity, like from the beginning. I think that a more cowardly writer would have given us some answers, and Melville does not.
Yeah, I know authors who give answers and they're all cowards. Yeah, so like, but yeah, well, and like to the sort of, to me at some point reading this, it's like that sort of atmosphere of ambiguity is the thing that moves the plot along. Like at the end of the Black Guinea section, like Chris has pointed this out, like a character like drops a business card and then another character in the next chapter obtains it, and that's like the premise of the next con. And so it's like whether or not Black Guinea is conning people or not, like the sort of the questions that people raise, the claims to authenticity, like that is quote unquote what the book is about. And so then you see that sort of thing happen in the next section and in the subsequent sections in terms of like what is the con, whose confidence is being taken advantage of, and like what's the technique by which it's like done.
Yeah, and all these cons rely on these different setups, right? So one con man might kind of intentionally fail with the young scholar who's reading all this dark, depressing work, and then that intel is used later on to take a different approach with them, right? So there's these setups too, where the first you think maybe he's trying to con this scholar through one way, but he's actually going to set it up later so that he can get him to buy in stocks, and this scholar feels very proud of himself and like, I'm not just a readerly scholar, I'm interested in money. And he becomes a really easy victim because the confidence man's already learned this background on him.
And the young scholar section is probably one of the funniest ones, just because like one of the confidence men says, "Don't read Tacitus. Tacitus has a very bad, pessimistic view of the human race. Have more confidence. Read somebody positive." And then he tosses like the book off the boat, basically. And then in the next scene with the guy who has the book, who's in charge of the black coal stock, he's basically saying like, "Oh well, like some philosophers would have been into stocks." And then he lists like optimistic philosophers, and he's like, don't listen to the pessimistic ones, they're part of the bear market. like we don't want them to buy stock. So that's like the perfect thing to say to this guy to get him to buy stock in like a dubious company, which we're sort of, there are multiple clues in the stock con scene that the company's dubious and that the stock market might not be true, as the way the guy's presenting it.
And the con relies on someone else being an idiot, right? So the con man before us is set up like, I'm the idiot who just thinks that we need to get rid of this depressing literature, and let's both make fun of that guy, and let's be the smart people we are, invest in stocks.
Right. And like, and that's almost like paralleled in the opening scene where like they're trying to find people to go verify Black Guinea's identity. And they're like, oh, let's have this priest do it. Like, oh, and this other priest starts like fighting another guy. As you're saying, the scene deteriorates with Black Guinea. So there's it's almost, to me, I have to talk about this book in terms of like related scenes, because I feel like drawing a frame around each one is like, you can do it, but it's like really difficult. So because like we're jumping around a little bit in this first half, but I think like things are like contained so much that you can kind of do that.
Yeah, well, so I think that it's interesting because, like we've said, this book does not have like a strict structure it's adhering to. And that's, even like when I say that, I don't just mean it's not adhering to like the traditional novelistic structure. Like it doesn't even necessarily have like an internally consistent structure in the way that maybe we would consider like, there are other forms of writing that are episodic or, kind of use vignette a lot, like picaresque novels, for instance. But even this, it is, the way that it is sort of weaving in and out of different sort of scenes with different characters at different points in time, it's never consistent. You never quite know what you're going to get from one chapter to the next, especially once there are also points where, this book has a very strong like narrator voice. I mean that as a compliment, but like the narrator is a character. Like the narrator is someone who is it's not just kind of a bland third person calling balls and strikes type narrator. Like he is the narrator is intruding on the story at regular intervals in, you know, to give these essays or these asides or to give the summations of like short stories that theoretically like in the frame of the book are happening in vernacular speech, but are instead being given to us in like a more traditional short story frame sometimes not.
Yeah.
Which does create this disorienting atmosphere of you like. One thing I found myself wondering, and I don't know if I don't think there's a strictly speaking an answer to this question, but is there only one confidence man? Is it a man with just like a supernatural talent for disguise, or is it multiple confidence men who are noticing each other and kind of playing off of each other's cons as they go?
Yeah, that is kind of the question.
Yeah, you know, and again, if the confidence man is just one figure, how is he accomplishing this? How are these people not recognizing him when he's spoken to them mere minutes ago?
So my copy of Confidence Man had a introduction by a man named Daniel Handler, and my friend pointed out that man is literally Lemony Snicket. And there's a reoccurring joke in A Series of Unfortunate Events where Count Olaf can put on disguises and only the adults are fooled and the children don't realize it's Count Olaf. And now that you pointed out, John, I wonder if that somehow made its way into A Series of Unfortunate Events, where it's like, how is this man being able to change all these outfits? Like, wouldn't somebody notice if it is verifiably one man who's wearing outfits? So
yeah, there's the possibility that like this is a network of people. It is interesting to kind of read the book literally, like Ben and I were talking about with the footnotes. They kind of hammer home this is the devil and it's all symbolic, but is it actually possible that we could read this and say there's a network of people who conveniently leave the steamer at just the right time for another to come in and kind of take over whatever the con is, to pass along a business card or to pass along this information I got on this person on the boat who might be sympathetic to this cause.
The kind of clandestine connections between people is like a theme in the book. In the second vignette, the con is that this guy convinces someone else that he's also a Freemason. And uses that as his in to get money from this guy. Later, there's a scene where someone performs a literal like magical rite in front of somebody he's been trying to con, and it has like a very strange impact on the man and like changes his like perception of this person he's been conversing with. So after that, there's a literally like a mystical order with like a master and disciple like traveling on this boat. So it's something that's in the text, that there is kind of this, you know, we're in this microcosm of the world, but even then there's kind of these hidden connections between people. Even with the scholar, there's a reference to the fact that he's wearing a fraternity like brooch. And that's kind of how he's marked himself out as a scholar, but also like as a member of like he has connections. He's not just like a learned person, but he is a member of like a literal secret society. Like this is a point where fraternities are like literally like all doing skull and bones stuff.
Yeah, I think there's what Melville's doing there is he's also, again, like to Ben's point, he's making it very ambiguous. Like, could it be supernatural? It could be, but in the scene you referenced, John, I think there's this really sneaky thing that he's doing where he performs this sort of like magic ritual, but what actually happens is he's in that magical ritual, he's dropping coins, and that signals to Charlie Noble that this person isn't actually poor. They don't actually need money. They were just making a joke when they were asking me for money. So the narrator, as you said, John, is a character, and he's kind of like, oh, it's this magical thing happening. But if we like read the subtext, it's like Charlie Noble is really relieved because he's like, oh, my friend wasn't really asking me for money. I don't have to worry about that. He's dropping all these coins, but the narrator plays it like he's a snake charmer and he's doing this ancient incantation.
Yeah, summoning.
So the novel's like always like that. It could be literal, it could be supernatural.
Context-wise, we should mention that this scene that we're talking about is in part 2, where all of these shape-shifting con men have been exchanged for one person, the Cosmopolitan. And the Cosmopolitan might be a good guy, might not. And in the scene we're talking about, he's befriended a man named Charlie Noble, who himself has kind of an ambiguous name that we can talk about. And they're basically talking about how great good friends they are. And the Cosmopolitan, as doing a bit, goes, "Oh, we're such good friends. Can you give me $50?"
All of a sudden, out of nowhere.
Yeah, out of nowhere. And Charlie Noble like recoils this in disgust. At which point then the Cosmopolitan enacts this magical ritual where he drops a bunch of money in front of him, and as if signaling to Charlie Noble, as Chris just said, "I'm not actually poor. I don't need money. I'm just doing a bit." At which point then the narrator says, "You might think," doesn't he immediately go like, "Charlie Noble's behavior is actually explainable." like the narrator sort of shows up to be like, actually his change could be explained in some ways, but that's the context for that scene.
Right. It's very, very tongue-in-cheek. The title of that chapter is showing that the age of magic and magicians is not yet over.
I really like that passage, especially the preceding chapter, which is like 3 paragraphs long, and it's just describing Charlie Noble being like, "No, I won't give you money."
A metamorphosis more surprising than Ovid.
And just getting like incredibly distressed, like out of nowhere. It's definitely the shortest chapter in the book, and I like how he plays around with the structure there a little bit. So I want to step back a little bit because I feel like we've maybe gotten like a little lost in the weeds here. I want to talk about like the idea of like confidence and like what that is like in the book. Because I think that as we go forward and we look at more of these vignettes, that's going to be important. You know, I don't want to open up the dictionary and be like, Webster's English Dictionary like refers to a confidence trick as, but at the same time, I think that it's important, I think, to define like what Melville is talking about here and like definitely. Like how this is functioning, because I think that we talk a lot, you know, in contemporary America about like scams, about cons. You know, we live in the country that is probably more scam ridden than like any other in the entire world. Maybe not the entire world, but
we set the template.
Way more scams than like our peer nations in like the developed West, quote unquote. And I think that in this book, confidence is, I mean, it's trust. It is the creating of like connection and fellow feeling between people, in which one of those parties, or in some cases, both of those parties, are not honest about their intentions. Yeah. You know, it is about finding a way to connect with a person and then using that to get something out of them, whether that is money or, I mean, generally money, but it could be other things. I don't know if there's any, you know, it's interesting. There's not really anything in this book where like the con man's never like, he's never trying to like get sex or like a place to stay. Like, it's always money in this book, which might also say something about America. And it might also be like what Melville could get away with writing about. I don't know if he could have had a scene where like the confidence man like tricks a woman into like sleeping with him.
Or to get something other than money, because it seems mostly money. Yeah.
But even the money is fairly insubstantial. It's not like he's getting huge amounts. It's just like, it's the thrill of conning someone, right? Getting their confidence, right? Even if it's just a couple coins.
Yeah, well, and I think that is like what, you know, the con man in like American history is kind of almost a romantic figure, not necessarily like a noble one, but one that we we like, there's a ton of like lovable con men throughout American like literature and culture. The Wizard of Oz is a con man and ends up being a nice guy at the end. I think that there's this thing in America where, because this whole country is founded on like theft of land and resources, typically violently, I think that there's an underlying assumption that like theft is always a possibility, but that makes theft without violence like a esteemable goal.
Yeah.
Like the fact that the confidence man is someone who takes from other people, which in America we all subconsciously understand is just the reality of life, but does it without actually hurting or coercing anyone, in a way becomes like almost a moral act.
Yeah, because and I mean, land theft is also in the book. We don't have to talk about the chapters about Native Americans, but that is in the book as well. And I think also, yeah, the idea of living by your wits, I think, is also an American ideal, even if you, are defrauding people. That's sort of the romantic image of living by your wits and not being like, an employee or something. That's also like an American goal, like bootstrap mentality.
Yeah, we're used to seeing like now the con man is someone who we like because they are usually conning someone who has a lot of power and doesn't necessarily deserve that power, right? The authority. Here, like a lot of the people we feel pretty badly for, especially, this guy at the end or this miser, right? These are people who we don't want to see conned. And I think the con man has like taken on that romantic notion more and more that we can kind of believe, oh, they're only getting the people who deserve to be got, basically.
Yeah. And I think, too, the book is also focused on the feeling of confidence, like you were saying, John, like that fellow feeling, because I think like that is also just as important. And friend of the show, Sammy Atassi, once told me that I should look up this chapter on this book by the academic C.N. Nye. And she talks about how it's the fluctuations of the feeling of confidence that are like what the book is about. And the money is like a marker of that. And so if you can exchange markers for those, like that, you can verify I have confidence. But then she argues that it actually really doesn't exist. And all of the confidence men are saying like, you don't have this thing, you need it. Like the idea of like, you have to possess this thing to have confidence, and like you should have fellow feeling because then you'll feel better. Not because, maybe you don't trust anyone who's on this boat for various reasons. But I think the image of the con man, like you guys were saying, is like, yeah, we're used to it being a certain way. And I think this is like definitely, we feel bad when that old man gets like his money taken away because he's an old man. Like it shouldn't happen to him. But yeah.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there, Ben, in terms of like the fact that the confidence that is inspired throughout this book is, I mean, it is in its way like its own reward. Not saying it's worth like what people are paying for it, but there is this sense that people like want to trust.
Yeah,
they want to believe that these bonds that are being forged or have been forged of friendship, of like again these secret societies, of religion, of in a way race at certain points in the book, that these mean something. I think that it's also important. We haven't talked about him yet, but there's Pitch, the Missourian, who is a great deal is made of the fact that he is kind of he's from the backwoods. He's not used to being like quote unquote in society. And he is like the person who is least trusting of these confidence man figures that he comes across. But there is a point that is made at other points in the book where it's like, well, that's also kind of an impoverished way of dealing with people. So there's an ambiguity here. There's an ambivalence about society itself and the fact that in being in society, like we have to trust other people, but that means that at some point you will be taken advantage of.
Yeah, and speaking of the trust thing, I want to make a brief biographical note because I think this is one of my favorite things about Melville. So Nathaniel Hawthorne is talking about Melville, like their meeting, I believe. I can't remember where they're meeting, but Melville is someone who also, I think, personally struggled with placing certainty and belief in certain things. And this quote is from Hawthorne's diary, because you were just talking about like the want to feel trust and confidence. And so Hawthorne says, Melville gave Hawthorne a manuscript for The Confidence Man, and then Hawthorne later recorded his concern about Melville, noting, they took a pretty long walk together and sat down in the hollow among the sandhills and smoked a cigar. Melville, as he always does, began to reason of providence and futurity and of everything that lies beyond human ken, and informed me that he had pretty much made up his mind to be annihilated, but still he does not seem to rest in that anticipation, and I think will never rest until he gets hold of a definite belief. It is strange how he persists and has persisted ever since I knew him, and probably long before, and wandering to and fro over these deserts as dismal and monotonous as the sandhills amid which we were sitting. He can neither believe nor be comfortable in his unbelief, and he is too honest and courageous not to try to do one or the other. Which one is, I think, kind of funny, just the idea of Melville saying, yeah, I'm going to be annihilated. And then he's just like, I can't take one thing or the other. And Hawthorne's like, that's a courageous view to have. But I think, as you were saying, John, I think you can kind of see that like filtering into the book. And I know I was telling Chris this in one of Melville's earlier books that I've read, because I've only really read one more other than Melville, this, or Moby Dick, this, and the third one was Marty. In Marty, there's one character who's like the skeptic, and it's just contained in one character. And I think in Confidence Man, it's almost like suffused throughout the entire book. Like this sort of like, skepticism and sort of like, I can't really place confidence in everything. Everything's so ambiguous.
Yeah, I think this is a theme throughout most of Melville's work. The work that most people have read besides Moby Dick is probably Bartleby. And Bartleby is all about this idea of charity, right? Bartleby is the story of this person who starts working for a lawyer. The lawyer soon realizes that he's homeless and he's been living in the lawyer's quarters. He feels badly for him. He keeps trying to help him, but nothing seems to be working. And at one point, he describes charity as a sweet morsel that he can have to feast on later. So it's like we give charity because it's going to make us feel good about ourselves. We want to feel good, so we do this charitable thing. And it just never works with Bartleby. No matter how much the lawyer tries to help him, it doesn't work. And finally, he has to give up. And Bartleby, basically ends up in debtor's prison. And this is kind of a familiar theme where Melville was just like, helping people is just impossible in this world. It's a nice idea, but it never works.
Yeah, and then the lawyer like washes his hands of Bartleby at the end too. Like it's very much like, well, I tried, I can't save this poor man, and then he dies in prison. And it sort of ends like with the lawyer like turning Bartleby into like a lesson about humanity and not like actually saving him. But
just a quick line from Bartleby on that point. The narrator says, "To a sensitive being, pity is not seldom pain. And when at last it is perceived that such pity cannot lead to effectual succor, common sense bids the soul to be rid of it."
Yeah, common sense. Yeah.
Like eventually, and this is kind of a theme in The Confidence Man, right? Eventually, you have to give way to common sense, right? Eventually, you have to recall your debt from your friend, even though they're your friend, because that's the rules of the practical world.
So unless we have something else we want to say, I do want to talk about the as you were saying, John, the mystical order, i.e. Ralph Waldo Emerson and David Thoreau, the two characters that show up, Mark Winsome, and then I don't remember Egbert's first name. But it's like that's Emerson and Thoreau. And I do want to talk about this unless we have something else that we want to bring up on confidence or like circulation of it through the book. So, because like the footnotes are, again, it's interesting because I don't think I would have gotten that this is a reference to Emerson and Thoreau without the footnotes, because the subject of the conversation between them and the Cosmopolitan is like about giving money for friendship. And I like that Melville presents Emerson as like quoting in Greek that the text doesn't even bother to tell you what it is. And the Cosmopolitan goes, "Oh, that's cool. What does that mean?" And he gives another word in Greek that isn't translated. And the Cosmopolitan Cosmopolitan is just like, oh wow, I don't know what that is either. like the idea that like Emerson is just too smart and too like he's like also doing a con in terms of what he understands that he doesn't bother to explain it. And then Egbert is presented as this like industrious young man who is just as good at philosophy as he is at business. I find that to be like a rather sort of scathing satire of at least like the Emerson Thoreau dynamic, that they're just like good business guys and that they don't actually really like believe anything interesting, or that if you question them, then it sort of falls apart. And to me, I found that to be very funny. Also, Edgar Allan Poe shows up randomly in that conversation. The random beggar that Emerson says go away to, the footnotes is like, this might be a caricature of Edgar Allan Poe. And so I like that there's like this weird influx of historical personage like in the back half with the Cosmopolitan, because like I was telling Chris, I kind of like the Cosmopolitan, even though if he's a bit of an asshole, and that he's probably also conning people, in that like he's sort of questioning various people. Whereas if the first half is like, what is this confidence? Like, can we have trust in man? Like, is it just used to manipulate people? And now it's just like, do you have confidence in what you believe, is sort of like what the Cosmopolitan is asking people. And yeah, he's also getting away with money, but that's like the flip of the book, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree with that on the structural level. I feel like we kind of almost get to with the Cosmopolitan, we almost enter like a Socratic phase with the book, where he's going to these people and kind of interrogating them on their beliefs, asking them like what they believe, and maybe pointing out the ways in which people are like conning themselves in a way.
Yeah, especially with, you mentioned Pitch, the Missourian, which I like that Pitch is like this close to like dancing with the Cosmopolitan, and then he like calls the Cosmopolitan a dog, or like, and the Cosmopolitan is like, no, I'm out. Like, I don't know why you would say that about me. Like, sorry, no dancing for you, Mr. Pitch. I felt like sort of sad, because I feel like Pitch is like just around, like coming around to being more sociable, and I'm sure the Cosmopolitan would probably scan him, but he's just like, no thanks. And then there's that scene with the barber where it's like that long thing about like trying to get the barber to take down his sign. And then like the Cosmopolitan basically uses that to get out of paying. So.
Yeah, I think the theme, and it goes to the Emerson parts that Melville was often thinking about in this book and others, is that Christianity does not work within capitalism. It's just the two can't exist, and that whole kind of Socratic discourse between him and Egbert is just continually proving that point, right? That in Melville's mind, Emerson and Thoreau, they lacked heart, right? So there's these very heady ideas, but what happens like when the heart's involved, in Egbert, just he sticks to it. He's like, I made you a loan as my friend, but I got to get it back for you. And that's the Cosmopolitan's game in the second half, is like, can people actually move away? Interestingly, ironically, can people move away from this capitalist mindset and just want to care about other people? Is kind of the whole game with Emerson and Thoreau characters there.
Yeah, especially too, like the sort of like you were talking about common sense. It's like, yeah, the common sense is that I shouldn't lend my friend money, and the Cosmopolitan that keeps pushing him to be like, do you really mean that? Like, please, you're my friend. Like, don't you care for me? Like, I also like, okay, one of the footnotes said that the sums of money weren't actually that big. I think you had mentioned that, Chris, but it's just funny hearing a character go like, hey, you're my friend, can you give me $50? Like, there's just something kind of funny about that on its face. But
it's always just so sudden. It's like, it's just like, there's a lot less craft in terms of the cons later on. It's just like all of a sudden he's like, can you give me $50? We're pretty good friends, right? It's like, hey, what? I thought we were actually friends. Now you're asking for money. And so it's like, how can money and friendship and good feeling really exist, right? The same thing with Bartleby. It's like, how can I run my law office and still care for this person who is poor and homeless?
Well, there's also the bit in kind of the discourse on Indian haters, where they make reference that these Indian haters, they like live out in the woods like all by themselves, but every so often they're struck with this sense of like loneliness or like desire to connect with another person, and they'll like just find the nearest Indian camp and they'll be really, really nice and friendly for like a night, and then they'll leave and go back to being bigots. And there's just kind of this constant push and pull between the real human desire to like help and connect and the, you know, needs of the market or the needs of the individual to sustain themselves in some way that requires taking, more or less. And I think that's really like the core of what Melville's trying to tease out here is like, is there any hope for that like feeling to be redeemed in some way, or is it always going to be a con in some way?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just to add a little bit of Melville context to this theme, because it comes up in the novel before Pierre, where he reads this tract by a philosopher, and it's called Chronometricals and Horologicals. And the idea is that a chronometer is able to adjust itself to Greenwich Standard Time. And this philosopher says that's what God's heavenly truth is. It's a chronometer. As opposed to a horological is man's kind of terrestrial truth. And basically he says if a chronometer existed, if a chronometrical soul existed in the world, they basically never make it. If you want proof of that, look at Jesus Christ. He was a chronometrical soul. He lived to God's standard, and they killed him. Therefore, we should interpret from that we cannot try to live up to the chronometrical standard. We just need to be horological. We basically need to do what he says is our expedient best. We give some money to the homeless. We give some money to charity. We make some mistakes here or there, but basically it's impractical. The Sermon on the Mount is impractical. We shouldn't really be asked to turn the other cheek if someone hits us. We shouldn't ask to give away all our belongings to the poor. Our Creator never meant for us to do that. We're supposed to be horological. And that feels like it's another parody of kind of Emerson, where it's like,
yeah,
we're just supposed to do our best within this particular world. We can't live up to the chronometrical standard of God. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, and I like too that, like, because I think I read the plot summary PR. Doesn't he read that, and then that's sort of like he ends up like the character ends up like declining a little bit after he reads that, or is he just like, oh, that's interesting, and then they don't go back to it in Pierre?
Well, Pierre is just another story of someone who basically sacrifices their whole life for someone else. In this case, a woman who says that she's his sister and she's indigent and doesn't have much hope. And there's a weird romantic connection between them as well. There's reason to believe she could be his sister, but yeah, Pierre gives up everything, ruins his whole life to help this person, and it does not end up going well for Pierre in the end. So it's a familiar theme of Melville of like, I'm going to sacrifice, I'm going to help someone else, I'm going to live up to this high Christ-like standard, but you're never rewarded in this world for being Christ-like in Melville's worldview.
Well, yeah, and then like there's sort of like a similar theme there with the China Aster stuff in The Confidence Man, where they talk about like getting a loan and having to repay the loan, and some rich guys like be confident, and China Aster's like, well, I would if I won the lottery. Like, and so like there's that kind of like questioning on like, like what is this high standard? Could you live to it, or are you constantly like caught between like the relative value and like the common sense marketplace idea, stuff like that.
Well, it's interesting because there's almost a theme running through Melville, too, of the ways in which really believing in something makes you insane and probably will kill you. Like, again, that's Ahab's like tragic flaw in a way, is that he believes that he has to kill the white whale come hell or high water. Aster believes in this vision of the angel telling him, like, if you just like work hard and do your best, everything will turn out for the best. And again, just the people here who believe what they're told and who trust in other people, end up losing something for it. I do think it's interesting, though, this is, again, maybe one of the points where it's a little bit interesting from the standpoint of reading this book in 2025. Obviously there are some cons here, like again, the miser getting the fake medicine, or the fake
the herb doctor, yes,
or the fake lock at the end, or the door that can't be unlocked or whatever. There are these more material cons, but there are also like kind of these more spiritual or emotional cons that almost feel like it's a little more ambiguous in terms of like how much is lost versus how much is gained.
Yeah.
Like with the oh my gosh, sorry, my brain is just not working well today. Like with the scholar who exchanges like a pretty small amount of money, but does get to laugh at the guy who tried to throw his book out the window, or the guy who asks for $50 for a guy he just made friends with. I mean, it is in a way a con, but on the other hand, like he did kind of become friends with that guy. Like there is this question of like, okay, what is being lost here? Or again, in terms of like the donations to the Seminole Women and Children's orphanage, he takes, again, pretty small sums of money from people. But like Chris was saying earlier, those people get to feel good about themselves. And how are they ever going to find out if the money actually went to an orphanage?
Well, yeah, it's like the idea of like, rather than placing confidence in someone, it's like you're the one who gets to feel confident. Like it's like the goal. Yeah. The mark feels confident.
So it almost is, there is almost like a reading in which at least some of these scenarios, like there is a way in which the confidence is like a thing you're paying for. And I don't know, I feel like that's interesting from the standpoint of like living today where it's so much easier to kind of track like where your money goes. Not all the time, but most of the time, you can tell if there is a real Seminole Women's and Children's Orphanage, and you can call, you can ask, hey, did you get my donation? And someone will tell you if they did. I don't know if quite what maybe the friction there is, but I definitely feel like there's something interesting there.
Well, I mean, as we were, like I was mentioning, it's like interesting reading this now and the stock market is dipping. It's like some people placed, confidence in being in the stock market and seeing it fluctuate so rapidly. It's like, well, that's, people are freaking out and panic, the idea of like trading panics and like the fluctuations in feeling driving the stock market and vice versa. Like, I still think there's something in terms of, like you were saying, John, what people feel confident about, even if like, yeah, you can trace your money. It's like, yeah, do you feel confident on the stock market? Like, do you feel confident on various other, political topics we could talk about? It's like, where does it get placed? So,
yeah. Well, go ahead, Chris.
I was just going to say it's interesting that there's always skepticism around the confidence man. None of them are like just stupid. They're like, let me see a receipt. Like, and he provides that, or can you give me this thing? And he provides it. And there's this tension, and I think we feel it still today, that no matter how much money we give, there's like this awful feeling when we get conned, right? And that's what drives all the angst about Black Guinea, is simply that the fear with Black Guinea is just that we're going to get conned. It's not like, oh, I gave so much money to this person. It's like, I got fooled by someone who might have just dressed up in blackface, and they got my sympathy and they got my pity, but they weren't real. And so there's these like conflicting feelings of how good it can feel to give genuinely to someone who deserves it, but how bad it feels, no matter what the sum is, to give to someone who was tricking you all along.
Yeah. And the way in which that anxiety, like, typically only leads in one direction. Like, it leads you to become more miserly and like less trusting.
Yeah.
And you end up like pitch.
Black Guinea does not like get a happy ending. Like, everyone is mad at him.
Well, doesn't he leave the boat? Like you were saying, I think somebody says like, oh, he left or something.
Yeah, he gets off the boat, but it's still this thing of like, it's not like that people come to the conclusion that like, oh, well, maybe it's worth it to give on the off chance that this is genuine. The mere introduction of suspicion suddenly turns like all tides against him.
Yeah.
And I think that's it, because again, like I think the limits of confidence are something that's interesting. It's been really interesting this weekend. There have been all these protests happening all over the country as a lot of people, presumably quite a few of them, people who voted for Donald Trump in the election, realize like, oh, he can't just make it 2019 again. The thing that I was unconsciously voting to happen he's actually going to do like all these moronic tariffs and crash the economy, and seemingly for no reason.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, the buyer's remorse is a powerful thing. And I don't have like a prediction, but it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out here in the next couple months.
Well, and along those lines, I do kind of want to talk about the last scene because I think it's related to what we're saying. And also, people have accused this book of being unfinished, and I feel like the ending is very purposeful. Unless we want to hit anything else before we do that.
I mean, Chris, do you have any other scenes you really like that you maybe want to talk about at all?
No particular scenes. I think we're touching on the main things.
Yeah, I don't have anything in particular to go over. I mean, I think there's other parallels we could draw between like particular types of cons they're running and like modern examples. Like the herb doctor is like a character that feels like very familiar, though now he'd be saying that herbs are like fake and gay and make you soy, that you should only be eating like liver.
Yeah, I was like, I was thinking like RFK the whole time with the herb doctor, like when he's talking about like nature is good, nature cannot hurt you, like, you know, like
nature is good.
Nature.
Yeah, I'm gonna have these nice herbs. Yeah, but,
like that almost feels like a little pat. I don't really know if there's much to say there other than to just like provide a taxonomy of things that people probably already know.
Right. Because I feel like, yeah, because I feel like the ending is like, again, there's something purposeful there, even if I can't say exactly what it is. Yeah. So I think the ending is interesting to talk about just because the Cosmopolitan is there. He is reminded of a Bible passage that he wants to check, and he sees an old man looking at a book, which I believe is the Bible. And then a young boy comes in and basically sells the old man on various safety devices, including like a door that can't be opened, a money belt so he can hide his money, as well as a book that he can use to verify false bills versus real ones. And so the boy is described as kind of frightening and a little scary. And there's an old man there's another man who's trying to sleep. And so the man who's trying to sleep keeps talking about what's happening in this conversation about those items. And then basically the old man needs help getting back to his room. And so they douse the one light that's on in the room after the boy leaves. And then it ends basically right there. And the last sentence is something further may happen of this masquerade. And I think there's a kind of like, there's a lot of like apocalyptic imagery. There's a lot of like whether or not the Cosmopolitan robs that old man in the dark is a question that we could talk about. And I think the ending to me feels very like, you know, this is how things are going to end like this. Like there's not going to be any certainty that comes suddenly. Like you're still going to be verifying stuff. And I feel like you need to be there basically like in the dark kind of. And you could read it that the old man trusts the Cosmopolitan. And so then that's like the feeling we're talking about taking care of people in front of you. Or you could read it as the Cosmopolitan gets to rob the old man on his way back to his room because he's got all of his stuff out. I think it's a purposeful ending there to me in terms of like, Melville doesn't have the answers. Like you're going to have to figure these things out basically. To me, that feels purposeful and not sudden. Although I think at first glance, it can feel that way. So.
Yeah. And it's interesting that scene, this final scene starts with, as Ben said, the confidence man is looking in the Bible. He's looking to verify if something is actually there that the barber said to him. And
yeah,
I was kind of wonder if the confidence man is this devil figure, or is he actually like, he's naive, he really genuinely does not know like what's in the Bible. It's like, I gotta look there, that's crazy, that's in the Bible, I can't believe they would say that, I gotta look that up, I gotta verify that. And so there is the possibility that like the confidence man is maybe this kind of antichrist figure, but it's also that he has this lack of knowledge about how the world works, and it's like genuinely surprising to him, like, why wouldn't my friend lend me money? I don't understand. And he's like legitimately trying to learn.
Yeah.
But to kind of jump ahead a little bit to the ending, I talked to Ben a little bit about this. The very last pages are a little bit hard to pick up on what's happening. But basically, before they go to the old man's bedroom, he wants a life preserver, to have some confidence, right? I'm not going to drown. I have this life preserver. And the confidence man is like, well, the thing you're sitting on is great, and it's this little bar stool. If you read closely, you can see that it's a commode. It's like a little porta potty, and so this old man is literally leaving the scene with a crock of shit in order to preserve his life. And so we get the little hint at the end when he says, "Oh, but bless me, we are being left in the dark here. Pa, what a smell too." And so this image is so dark at the end. This chapter called "An Increase in Seriousness," where the confidence man is leading this old man who has a little porta potty in his arm that he's hoping is going to be a life preserver that saves his life. And it's this perfect metaphor, the kind of April Fools of, you think you have a life preserver, it's literally a crock of shit. It's not going to save you.
Oh, I was going to say, so I like that image a lot, Chris. Thank you for noting that, because that kind of went over my head as I was reading. So yeah, the ending, it does feel abrupt just from the standpoint that, again, the book does not have like a kind of a natural pace it's moving at. And so it's not like things like all of a sudden we've like reached the natural concluding point. Like theoretically, I could see a version of this book that's like 100 pages longer and just does more bits, more or less.
Yeah.
But I do think it's interesting from the standpoint that I feel like it is this kind of powerful bit, like you said, of like apocalyptic energy of kind of hearkening towards the future of Scam America.
Right.
The fact that there is a child who is not, this is, I think, the first child we've seen in the book. There's very few women, very few children. I think there's maybe one or two other women in the book who actually are like characters that are appearing in the main narrative.
Yeah.
And then this, I think, is the first child we've seen. And this child is in some ways like a better, more confidence man than the confidence man. He is able to like talk this guy out of his money like faster and like with like more spurious claims than the confidence man has made throughout the rest of the book.
Yeah.
And like, this is the future of America. This is what is being inculcated in the youth. This is what the dominant mode of like relation to other people is going to be. It is going to be, in some ways, it's going to be the young robbing the old. Whether that's, I think there's almost like kind of an imperialist metaphor there in terms of like the young country of America, like robbing blind, like the great cultures of the past. But I think that there's also just kind of like a very blunt, like, oh yeah, like, no, we're teaching like young people that it's fine to like take old people's money because they're old. They don't need it. They're going to die. Who cares? And that is apocalyptic. Like that is incredibly grim. I do think it's interesting from the standpoint that we're ending with apocalypse, but there's not really like an intimation of like a better past exactly throughout this book. There's maybe a little bit in terms of like the ways that he kind of like is ironically referencing Indians and the way that white people deal with Indians, or I should say native people. And the fact that like, it does seem like there is kind of an intimation that like, okay, white people did kind of make all of this a lot worse when they showed up and like started imposing all these things on the natives. But that doesn't feel quite right for like what he's charting out as the future.
Right.
And I do think that's interesting because it's kind of, it feels like Melville's saying something like what he views as like kind of the state of nature of humanity, but also implying that it's just going to get worse.
Yeah, the young will rob the old, and like that kid is like hustling the older guy out of his money for these like security devices, basically.
I also think it's interesting that again, it's clearly intentional that he's checking the Bible as kind of this apocalyptic scene is happening.
Yeah.
And you have like a literal like sleeper, you have a lamp going out. It's very deft, but it is like a little ambiguous in terms of what it means in the context. Like, is there any value in the Bible, or is it just another con in a way? Like there's this way in which Melville kind of feels like he's conning us with all this, all these references, all these kind of like clever word games that are covering up an old man walking away with a crock of shit.
Just and being told that'll save him. Yeah.
There's almost this way in which the act of literature itself becomes like a cover for like an ugly reality, which I think is something that the book does at certain points earlier, where it's talking about like how does fiction work? How do good characters work? Yeah. There's kind of always this thing where it's like, well, you need to make it like realistic, but not too realistic. You need to like, things need to be consistent more than they need to be realistic. And that's what people really want out of fiction.
Yeah.
They want something that is going to like be a consolation, even if it's in some way false. And this kind of almost feels like, again, if this is his farewell to prose, this is kind of his final word on that. It's like, yeah, all these pretty words, all this like highfalutin philosophy, all these references to these books that you've been told are so important, like Shakespeare and the Bible. It's all just a cover for absolute depravity and stupidity. And really no one actually has any kind of wisdom or insight that can like provide you some kind of solace.
Yeah, and even with the Bible, the thing in this scene is the old man is like, oh, actually, that's in the Apocrypha, so we don't have to worry about that. And it points to like, what do we decide is part of the narrative, what's not part of the narrative, right? This is theoretically just as legitimate as something else that was written in the Bible, but no, we're recording that off, so that's fine. You don't have to worry about that. That's just the Apocrypha anyway.
Well, and that's also twinned with like the fake bills book, because it's like the book is about fake money, and then the Apocrypha is labeled as like fake Bible, like it's not the real thing. So there's like a kind of like parallel that he draws there too.
Yeah, so a lot of the best conning happens with people who are skeptical, right? Because you can have this fraud detector, and then of course the idea that the fraud detector could also be a fraud, right? And thinking about the political landscape, a lot of times is people wanting to see themselves as really smart. This is the narrative that I was told, but actually I found my own sources, and this is the real thing. So because I think I'm being conned in this way, therefore I found the truth on the other side. Instead of trying to like adjust those things together, there's this eagerness to think that we sussed out the con. And then we miss that we might be being conned again. We might be right. We might have sussed out a con. That doesn't mean we can't be getting conned by something else. And that's the fraud detection, right? Just because this thing can detect fraud in one way doesn't mean I'm not going to be defrauded in another.
Yeah. It's interesting. I don't want to get like too lost in the weeds on like contemporary politics, but it's interesting because even all this incredible bullshit with these like tariffs, it's all in the frame of the president thinks we are getting conned. Like if you listen to Trump talk about like why he wants to do these tariffs, it's because he thinks that like a trade deficit is a con. It means that like we are somehow being taken advantage of, even though like this whole system has been set up for our benefit. Like it is literally us defrauding the rest of the world, but there is this fantasy that somehow we're being taken advantage of, and that if we could just get rid of that con, then everything would work great. So even like the con artists are just as paranoid about being conned as anyone else is.
Yeah, that's like, I feel like that's also like a trope in con artist movies. Just like the con artists like finally willing to believe something, and then there's like a twist at the end of the movie where it's like, actually, you're a sucker. So
yeah, that's what P.T. Barnum said, and we see all the different references Melville makes in there. If you have the footnotes, a lot of the references are to people that were in P.T. Barnum's stable of what he would call freaks, right? A lot of which were just based on what are people gonna believe? What can I make people believe?
Yeah, it's. I do wish I'd had those footnotes, because like there was like, this was like a golden age of like con artists, but also like knowledge about con artists. Like again, P.T. Barnum wrote his life story. Like people knew they were being conned to some degree, like regularly. but there's always this feeling, like you said, Chris, that you can somehow outsmart the con artists, that you can be the one who's getting one over on the suckers. And then, you know, consequently, always this anxiety when you are the one who's actually being conned. And I think that, like, that's at the root of a lot of like American paranoia.
Yeah. It's interesting to note the one scene that we didn't talk about. The only person that seemingly doesn't fall for the con is this what's called this dusk giant, this big man who enters on, who's clearly hobbled, even though he's so big. He has an ailment, and the herb doctor tries to con him, and basically the dust giant just punches him in the face, and that's the last we see of that guy. He's not going for it at all.
Yeah, Chris, I think you had mentioned, you're like, is the dust giant in on it to make the herb doctor feel more like he's like, oh, I've been attacked, please help me, or is him actually just like, is this the one? Yeah, like authentic reactions just be like, fuck you, like, get out of my face.
There's a possibility that like this person is a plant that creates more sympathy for the herb doctor to be like, wow, that he got punched in the face and he still forgave that guy. Actually, it turns out, you know, the herb doctor is a pretty good guy. But I like the other interpretation too. It's just like the moment you engage with a con man, you've already been conned, and the dust giant just doesn't engage. Like he just punches him in the face.
Right. Yeah. The skeptical person is the biggest mark.
Exactly.
This is one where I think I'm going to have to go back and reread it at some point, because I feel like a lot of it did just go right over my head.
Well, and that's why I brought up the footnotes, because I was like, I feel like the footnotes are also like a thing you have to contend with, like, which is weird too. Like, it's like, you know, with Chris's example, it's like, are they pushing an interpretation, or are they just giving just the facts? You know, like, it's like, I don't know.
But yeah,
well, even without the footnotes, I just mean, like, I feel like there's a lot of stuff that probably just clicks into place more and more if you, like, on a second read through. Yeah. Just like stuff that I just didn't notice because, you know, I'm just kind of in that first reading mode where you're just kind of necessarily like, I'm kind of a surface level.
Chris also knows that I gave him my edition to see the footnotes, and I had like written a triangle at one point in the margins because I was taking like really dumb notes, because I was just like, oh, like what's this, you know? So
and then he gave up like soon after.
yeah.
And there were no notes after that. I was like, damn. Ben got to one point, he was really trying earnestly, and then he's like, I'm out.
Yeah. So yeah, kind of a tough book, but.
So kind of as a way of wrapping up, definitely like a strange book. I definitely get, like, I like Moby Dick. You know, it's hard not to, if you're someone who's serious about literature, to at least be impressed by Moby Dick. I'm not saying everyone has to like it or love it, but I definitely get, like, I kind of get why Melville is not more widely read outside of it, because it seems like he just is really working at odds with, like you said, Chris, he's not like a great story writer. He's good at, like, he's a very talented like prose stylist. He's very good at like working ideas into fiction, but in terms of like just kind of the meat and bones of like, how do I put together a compelling plot? Not always the best at it.
So, like, his short stories tend to be better, and they get like read. Bartleby, even like Billy Budd, which was published after his death, like those. But like, if it goes beyond a certain length, he doesn't really have the chops to like develop a plot or like really develop a character. And like I said, Pierre is the only time that he really earnestly tries to write something that is a novel, and it's, you know, super deranged in its own way. So just the rails fall off of that one in the second half.
Maybe he just needed a better editor.
He did not like being edited. So
that's fair. Yeah. That's kind of what it strikes me as, you know, sometimes you read somebody who really needed a better editor, and sometimes I think Melville, I mean, in some ways that's the glory of Melville, is that it can get so like weird and woolly and non-traditional, but sometimes it's like a little more structure could maybe help.
Well, it's like, can you imagine the editor being like, yeah, cut out those great chapters where, you know, the narrator's analyzing the ship, and it's just like, we just need the plot. And then it's like, usually Moby Dick's like, you know, if it's abridged and it's just like the plot stuff, it's like they cut out, like, you know.
there's always a trade-off. I don't know. There's not a perfect answer, but I mean, this book is interesting. Like I'm not, mad that I read it, but it is interesting that he is this kind of singular figure in American literature where like anyone who's serious about literature as like an art form reads Moby Dick at some point. And, most people get something out of it, but very few people then go on to read any more of him. And most people like could tell you like, oh yeah, Herman Melville wrote Moby Dick. No one could probably tell you anything else he wrote.
Name a second book or a short story. Yeah. So
because like when somebody said Bartleby earlier, I was like, he wrote Bartleby the Scrivener? I didn't realize there was another story called Bartleby.
Oh, you wrote Bartleby the Scrivener. That's his.
That's his?
Yeah, but I'd prefer not to. Yeah.
So, okay, well there you go. So he wrote 2 stories called Bartleby. Or no?
No, it's just one. It's called the full title is just Bartleby the Scrivener. That's by
Okay. It's been a long time since I read that. So
so it's like there's the one other kind of story that like tended to get taught in high schools.
That's where I read it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like, I was just having a conversation with somebody at work, and they're like, I don't really like Benito Sereno, and then me and this other guy were like, it's pretty good. like we couldn't say it was bad. We're just like, it's like, Benito, and then Billy Budd. It's like, Bartleby, Benito, Billy Budd, and then I don't know. Like sometimes you see Paradise of Bachelors in like best American short story collections, but not frequently.
Yeah, and how many people actually have read a lot of those? Even people who are into literature, it's very few of these are like kind of on the canonical lists of like, oh, these are things you need to read. Mm-hmm. It's if you're a sicko who loves Melville, you'll love this. Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting because I can't think of a lot of other authors who feel so uneven in like their reception. I'm sure there are other examples, but in terms of like how highly regarded Moby Dick is compared to how a lot of these other works of his feel like they end up being either unread or really kind of being like deep cuts, things you only come to after you've like exhausted the rest of like what the American canon has to offer you.
Well, and I like reading his stuff because it feels like he's really contending with like the form of the novel. Like what does the novel do? And it's funny to see him like sort of like, match spears, as it were, with like what is expected out of a novel. And it ends up coming out like in this like, interesting, like weird platonic, like series of conversations where you can't really pin down any, certainty. It's not what you do normally, but it's very fun when you do read it. So
absolutely. Yeah. None of this is like to say that it's bad. It's just saying that he's an interesting figure. And I'm starting to understand like why he's the type of figure that he is, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Cool. Well, anything else you want to add, Chris? Like I said, any plugs, any advertisements or?
No, just leave it at that.
All right. Well, Chris, thank you so much for coming on the show. We'd love to have you on again sometime if you have another Melville or something unrelated you'd like to talk about. Thank you so much for coming on.
All right. Thanks for having me, guys.
You're welcome. Listeners, as always, you can follow the show on Blue Sky, YouTube. You can email the show at infinitelibrarypod@gmail.com. We're going to be returning here. We're going to be trying to get back to our regular schedule here soon. Apologies again for this one being late, but we're going to be back with Moonglow here in a week or two. And then we will have the last episode of this season on Nova by Samuel Delaney coming out here the first week of May. So until then, Semper Books.
Semper Books.
Thank you for listening to The Infinite Library. If you liked our show,
We hope you'll subscribe and leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the podcast app of your choice. It helps us a lot. If you want to follow us on social media, we can be found on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky at Infinite Library Pod. If you'd like to contact our team directly with episode ideas or feedback, you can email us at infinitelibrarypod@gmail.com. Our intro music is by Amos Legend in the Forest of Mayhem. Our outro music is by DJ Daggy Diggs, and our logo was created by Lars Noir.